I suppose there's some limitations to that, but I really do enjoy doing this, in part because I think it's very easy in the year of our Lord 2024 for people to lose sight of the reason why people read Dickens in the 1850s and 1860s and why he remains worth reading in 2024. I mean, as teaching in the English department at RIT, it's a very STEM-centered university. A lot more sort of explicit interest in the sciences and in mathematics. And one of the things that I am always struggling with there is how do I lure students into a course on Dickens or on the Brontes, on these 19th century novelists who many of them, specifically chose RIT because they wished to avoid such entanglements, right? Not all of them, though, but certainly some of them. And I feel like I'm always making a case for why we read these books. And one of the things that I'm fond of telling my students is, this generation of students is very interested in matters of social justice and economic justice, and they think about these things a lot. And I say to them, Dickens was writing his novels just a few blocks away from where Karl Marx was writing Das Kapital in 1867. They were both in London. They were both observing the same sets of circumstances and the same problems of poverty among the laboring poor and all that. You can think what you want about either Marx's analysis or Dickens's, for that matter. But the fact of the matter is that you could do a lot worse if you want to understand social and economic injustice in 2024 than go back and look at someone like Dickens, who was writing about these things in a highly imaginative, highly sympathetic, highly engaged way at the time that these issues were forming and becoming as sort of crushingly problematic as I think in some respects they have remained. Problems of urbanization and industrialization and worker exploitation and some of those things. So I always welcome the opportunity to go and speak anywhere about why Dickens is still worth reading. And in a case like this, what even current novelists are finding in Dickens that they can carry forward. So I'm glad to be here today. Thank you for coming, and thank you for accommodating the different starting time. As it happens, the medical appointment that I was supposed to have, I couldn't have because I had COVID last week, and that scuttled everything. So now I probably have a whole other array of medical things to get looked at. Who on earth knows? But I'm here, I'm upright, this is good, this is progress. Let's see. So talking about Demon Copperhead and Barbara Kingsolver, talking about David Copperfield and Charles Dickens, I hope you won't mind that I'm talking about both and that I'll spend a good bit of time on Dickens today as a sort of subtext or a pretext for Kingsolver's work, partly because I know Dickens a lot better than I know Kingsolver, but also because I think Kingsolver does some really interesting things with Demon Copperhead. Have most of you read Demon Copperhead? Okay, so I think she does some really interesting stuff. I also think that she departs fairly widely from Dickens and David Copperfield in important ways. So, I'm looking forward to talking about that. So, Demon Copperhead, published late 2022, Kingsolver's 10th volume of fiction. A couple of those volumes have been volumes of short stories, but several novels in there as well. And Demon Copperhead has gotten a whole lot of attention, I think, during the calendar year 2023. Won the Black Prize for Fiction, won the Women's Prize for Fiction, and I think most recently was she became a co-awardee of Pulitzer in 2023. So she is an accomplished novelist, and this is an accomplished novel. I mean, there's no way around that. Sales figures pretty difficult to determine because they're sort of ongoing and whatnot. But the novel has certainly sold in excess of 150,000 copies. I found a lower figure than that for like late 2023. But this is a pretty good sale by and large, especially for a book that professes to be based on Dickens, which many modern readers maybe don't have a whole lot of use for necessarily. And it modernizes David the cotton field and brings its broad plot outlines to rural Appalachia. Barbara Kingsolver is not the first person to think about imitating or adapting Dickens. I list here several. These are literally ones that came to my mind off the top of my head as I was working on this. I did not go and do extra research on this. Dickens has been imitated since before he finished his first novel, The Pickwick Papers. Because The Pickwick Papers, and we'll talk about this momentarily, Dickens published his novels in installments. They came out in monthly installments in almost sort of mini magazine fashion, as many of you may know. And The Pickwick Papers, his first book, became such a smash hit halfway through that it immediately attracted imitators who put out The Penny Pickwick. There were a couple of writers, among them Thomas Prescott Prest, who, if you have ever heard of or have seen the Sweeney Todd story, you know, the demon barber of Fleet Street, that is based on what was called A Penny Blood, that was published in the early 1840s by, we think, Thomas Prescott Prest. It was unsigned, and so we don't know for sure if he's the one who wrote it. Prest wrote this novel, The String of Pearls, in the early 1840s, at a time when he had already made an entire mini career out of writing Dickens knockoffs. So Oliver Twist, rather than Twist, Nicholas Nickelberry instead of Nicholas Nickleby, Barnaby Budge instead of Barnaby Rudge. I mean, this was a cottage industry within months of Dickens's name becoming a household name in 1836, 1837. And there are probably, like, these are just the ones that came to mind right away. There probably were dozens and dozens of these. Partly because there weren't real good copyright, guidelines that would prevent people from doing this. One of the big annoyances for Dickens throughout his career, certainly into the 1860s, was dramatists, playwrights doing cheap knockoff dramatic versions of his novels before they had even finished their serial installments. You'd have a playwright who was projecting how the novel was going to end, and they would do an entire play based on that. It would be, running at like the Adelphi or something like that in downtown London. And Dickens would be horrified and appalled because, first of all, this was not how the book was going to end. And second of all, there's a story of him seeing a dramatic adaptation like this of Oliver Twist in 1838, 1839. Oliver Twist was still running in serial installments in the magazine, and Dickens was so horrified by what they had done to his novel in adapting it for the stage that he had a balcony seat and he curled up on the floor in the balcony in the fetal position and just laid there for like the last act of the performance because he was just appalled at what they had done. So this was a cottage industry in the 1830s, 1840s. I would like to confirm for you that what Kingsolver is doing much more thoughtful than the publication of Oliver Twist or Nicholas Nickelberry or whatever. On the right-hand side of this slide, I've just given you some names of adaptations. The ones in blue are television adaptations. It's clear, by the way, there have been so many film adaptations of virtually every single one of Dickens' novels, all the way back from the era of silent film. Some of the earliest silent films that we have are adaptations of part or all of Dickens' books going back to the 1910s, 1920s. So what I have listed here, instead of getting into the question of which novels have had adaptations done of them, they all have, essentially. The three that I put in blue there are adaptations that do really interesting things. I don't know if any of you have seen The Man Who Invented Christmas, but it is sort of loosely based both on A Christmas Carol and the writing process that Dickens went through in the act of writing A Christmas Carol. Dodger is one that has just been airing that is based on the character of the Artful Dodger from Oliver Twist. Dickensian, the one at the very bottom of this list, fascinating. I don't know, has anyone seen Dickensian? I think you sort of have to bootleg it on this side of the Atlantic. Dickensian actually takes characters from a bunch of Dickens's different novels and brings them together in one drama that's told. And so you see characters who never met in Dickens's fiction playing part of the same mystery plot in 1840s London. And then there are lots of books that have carried these things forward. I have not read all of these, but What Emily Did Next is the story of little Emily from David Copperfield, and what she does in that period when she is not present in the novel, when she has run off with Steerforth, and it sort of tells her story. Jack Maggs is an account from the perspective of Abel Magwitch in Great Expectations, the convict who makes Pip rich in that book. And Mr. Timothy, I think, might be one of my favorites. Is anyone familiar with this book? By Louis Bayard. Mr. Timothy is based on Tiny Tim from A Christmas Carol, but he is an adult and he is living in a brothel. Where they're letting him stay for free because he's teaching the head madam how to keep accounting and how to read. And he gets embroiled in a bizarre, mysterious Victorian sex trafficking plot. I mean, it's just, you're reading this going, where on earth did this come from? I mean, all we know of Tiny Tim from, the novella is him saying, God bless us, everyone. It's so wholesome. And here he is, and he's, of course, fallen out with his family, who can't tolerate any of his shenanigans. But it is a really amazing read. So this is, so something like Demon Copperhead, not out of the realm of things that other writers have done. And there is a whole, again, cottage industry of people writing Victorian fiction that's really interesting. Someone like Sarah Waters and Fingersmith. Fingersmith is an amazing book. These are 21st century writers, using the setting of the 19th century and using sort of Victorian style plots, often predicated on orphans, street crime, and those kinds of things, to write some really, really interesting fiction. But more on that later. So, this is not a one-off. What Barbara Kingsolver is doing. It has been done many, many, many times with greater and lesser degrees of success, I think. Kingsolver says in her own acknowledgments at the end of the book, I'm grateful to Charles Dickens for writing David Copperfield. His impassioned critique of institutional poverty and its damaging effects on children in his society. Those problems are still with us. In adapting his novel to my own place and time, working for years with his outrage, inventiveness, and empathy, I've come to think of him as my genius friend. That's a nice, nice little tip of the hat on Kingsolver's part. And of course, she makes no bones about the fact that she's drawn by David Copperfield. So it's nice to see her saying this. Dickens certainly did write impassioned critiques of childhood poverty and institutional poverty and the damaging effects of these things on children. Oliver Twist, this is probably the most famous of all of them. It attacked the New Poor Laws of 1834, which Dickens felt had done more to harm the poor than to help the poor for a variety of reasons, one of the most destructive of which was it forced people who wanted poverty relief to actually enter workhouses and live in the workhouses, where it separated wives from husbands and children from both, and made them live in separate wings. So it was actually quite destructive of the nuclear family in 1834. Dickens thought this was a travesty. And there were other problems with it, but I'll leave it at that now. Feel free to ask me during the Q&A, and I can wax maybe slightly eloquent on that subject. Nicholas Nickleby exposed the horrors of the Yorkshire schools, boarding schools in the north of England. Aristocratic men had a bad habit of impregnating lower class women and then using the Yorkshire schools to get rid of the children. Send the children off to be in the boarding school where they were left malnourished, mistreated, abused, and many of them died. And Dickens went to the Yorkshire school posing as an aristocratic man looking for a school in which he could dispose of an unwanted child, and got as much information as he could, and he writes Nicholas Nickleby on those grounds. Bleak House, probably my favorite and the most ferocious of Dickens' attacks on institutional poverty. Not a well-known book on this side of the Atlantic, but a lot of scholars think that it's probably his best book. So for whatever that's worth. And Little Dorrit, which again, Little Dora, if anyone has read it, the whole premise of this book is that you have a young woman who was born in the debtor's prison because her father has been a convict or an inmate of the debtor's prison for 20-something years. And she is born into that prison, and she lives in that prison. And, so you want to talk about the institutional poverty and the damaging effect of institutional poverty on children. Little Dora is, a very powerful expose of that. The problem that I think I and a lot of scholars have with Kingsolver's sort of characterization is that most of us don't think of David Copperfield as a critique of institutional poverty. we tend to think of David Copperfield, for reasons that I'm about to get into, as an intensely personal account of a very unhappy childhood and an unhappy child who grows up to try to become a passable and relatively well-adjusted adult. And that's also an important story. And I think that's, for most of us who study Dickens closely, this is sort of what's at the heart of David Copperfield, much more so because the story of David Copperfield is so individualized. It's so predicated on that I who's narrating, that narrator who's looking back retrospectively on his sad childhood and reflecting on that and trying to explain how it's a Bildungsroman. It's a coming of age novel. It's literally the story of a little boy who has a bad childhood and grows up to be a writer. I mean, so that you don't get more Bildungsroman than that. When you're talking about a novel. Let me talk a little bit about David Copperfield. This was Dickens' 8th novel, published in installments between 1849 and 1850. It was one of his best-selling novels at the time it was published, averaged about 25,000 to 30,000 copies sold per month. I should say that doesn't sound like much, per se, but much like today, perhaps even much more so than today, every copy that was bought was probably read by more than one person. People pass these off and whatever. So as near as we can tell, in its original format, and coming out in serial installments, this was probably read by 5 times as many people as bought. I mean, and then when you factor in how many people were illiterate at the time and how often they relied on having the story told to them orally, right? Having someone read it aloud at a club or in a pub or whatever. I mean, this was reading for the masses by and large, to the extent that the masses were able to read. And during its serial run, it made Dickens approximately £6,000, which doesn't sound like a whole lot of money per se, but it was probably the modern equivalent of about $2 million. It's always hard to sort of break down these equivalencies between 19th century money and 21st century money, not only because it's hard to track the simple mathematical part of it, but because we don't buy the same things anymore. Like I've said that to my students before. Well, how many tallow candles did you buy last week? What did they cost? Let's compare. What they cost now with what they cost in the 19th century. So he made a good chunk of change from this novel. And in his 1867 introduction to Copperfield, he wrote introductions to all of his fiction in 1867 and released sort of a big extended hardcover collection of the whole thing called the Charles Dickens edition of his works. And he referred to David Copperfield in that introduction as his favorite child. Well, of course it was his favorite child, for a simple reason. This is what installments looked like, by the way. So in case, we are so used to, I don't have a copy of the novel in front of me, but we're used to seeing Dickens' novels as like these big ponderous tomes where it's all like, that is not what it looked like back in the 19th century. Every installment was just a little shabby, flimsy, green-covered installment printed on cheap paper, partly because Dickens wanted to make sure that these books were affordable for people of middle and working class, position. And so only later, and I actually do have this set up over there. If you look at that table to the side where the snacks are, I've set up a copy, not of David Copperfield. I don't have that, but in my personal collection, I had a copy of Dickens' last completed novel, Our Mutual Friend. And what people would do is they would often buy the novel like this, each month as it appeared. And then at the end of the serial run, they would have all of the installments bound in leather covers or whatever that would match their own personal library, if they had a personal library or whatever. That's what that is. That is one of the 2 volumes of Our Mutual Friend, and when we're done, you're welcome to sort of thumb through it and, whatever. Don't steal it. But by all means, thumb through it. You can look and see where each new installment starts, because this preserves the original green cover, and then the advertisements that appeared inside the cover. It was like just a little mini magazine. There's one of the other things I should point out about this. If you look at this, these 2 book covers, this is the cover of the installment of David Copperfield, and of course there's Kingsolver's novel. I see a few people even have copies of it here. You notice how it has all of this illustration sort of around the frame. That was a 19th century thing that Dickens really, he was the first person that we know, or we think we know, who published brand new works of fiction in that format of monthly installments. And it wasn't even his idea. He got lucky. He was the sort of the beneficiary of a perfect storm, where the publisher wanted to try something different. Dickens was recruited to write the story. In fact, the key person in that collaboration for the Pickwick Papers was the illustrator. It was the illustrator's idea, and the illustrator said, "I want to write some fiction, or I want to draw some illustration of inept sportsmen." I assume this meant like people falling off their horse while fox hunting, or going fishing and hooking their friend in the lip, as they're trying to cast their line or something. I don't know what exactly this means, but Robert Seymour was a known illustrator. He said, "I want to do some illustrations of inept sportsmen. We just need somebody who will write a lame story to go along with this, to sort of make the whole thing succeed." They approached several writers, far more lame than Dickens apparently, or at least people who were more I guess successful to the point where they didn't have to seize at this opportunity with both hands. And people kept saying no. And then they stumbled on Dickens' name. He was basically a cub report for a couple of London newspapers. He was covering parliamentary matters, had become a master of shorthand from having to take down parliamentary speeches as they happened. They approached Dickens and said, "Do you want to write for this?" And he says, "Yeah, sure, I'd be happy to write it." He's just gotten engaged. He needs money so that they can get married. He doesn't have sort of a stable income of any size from the newspaper reporting he's doing. He's like, "Yes, I would be happy to do this." So they sign him on as the author of the Pickwick Papers. Bear in mind, he has never lived in the country or done sportsman things ever in his entire life. So what his qualifications were beyond, "I write newspaper articles," is a mystery. Within a month or 2 of the collaboration beginning, Dickens seizes complete creative control of the project. He starts, this illustrator who is twice his age and has all of the reputation, Dickens begins critiquing his drawings and sending them back and saying, "No, this character doesn't look like this. You don't understand." And he wouldn't be wearing that jacket. He'd be wearing this other jacket. And this goes on for a couple of months. And meanwhile, the Pickwick Papers is selling like 400 copies a month. It's tanking badly, very, very badly. The publishers, after the first month, they print 500 copies, it sells 400. Second month, they print 400, it sells 300. And they're ready to pull the plug anyway. And then the illustrator, for reasons that are probably complicated, ends up killing himself in his studio. He has the recently revised illustrations that Dickens requested there in the studio next to all of his working materials. But he kills himself, and the publishers come back to Dickens and say, "We're pulling the plug on this project." And Dickens says, "I have it all under control. I can fix this, just trust me. Cut down on the number of illustrations, give me more space to write, and I will save this project, and I'll be damned if he doesn't do it." By the time you get halfway through the 20-month cycle of the Pickwick Papers, it's selling 10,000 copies. Then it's selling 20,000. Then it's 30,000. finally peaks at 40,000 copies a month, which is ridiculous when you think about 2 decades earlier, a book like Pride and Prejudice, which was not published in this format. Pride and Prejudice would have been considered a massive success at 1,500 copies sold, because books were very expensive, tended to be very expensive. A brand new novel at that time, freshly published, tended to cost about $500 in modern money. None of us would be doing much pleasure reading at that price. No one at that price is wandering through the airport looking for the next Dan Simmons or something to read on the airplane, right? People shouldn't be looking for that. But that's neither here nor there. People would not be buying fiction casually as a pastime if it cost $500 per book. So some of it had to do with Dickens being the right person at the right time. Some of it had to do with the innovation of the publisher and the illustrator, and the illustrator didn't even survive into the 3rd and 4th and 5th months of the project. But one of the innovations that Dickens eventually develops in conjunction with his illustrator, who becomes Hablot Brown, is this framing of the title of the work. And this same cover would have appeared on the entire, on every single issue. It didn't change from issue to issue. And the pictures are all little vignettes that if you add them up, they tell the entire story, right? You don't know that. It's hard to decipher until you've read the entire novel. And I just point this out as a way of saying Kingsolver essentially does the same thing. I mean, her publisher is playing with that same convention with little scenes and vignettes from her novel, forming the frame, right, around which the frame that goes around the title. So I wanted to put those the cover illustration and the wrapper design side by side for you, so you can see that even Kingsolver's publisher is in on the game, right? The graphic designer for the cover is in on the game. Now, why was Charles Dickens' favorite child David Copperfield? Because it was him. It just was. Explicitly, well, not quite explicitly. I mean, we sort of know the signs now. He wasn't going to own up to this at the time. Dickens started writing an autobiographical fragment in around 1847. We don't know because it was never published, so it wasn't quite dated in any kind of clear way. But we think it was probably around 1847. He writes an autobiographical fragment. He gets up to about age 12, and he decides that thereafter, the process of writing this autobiography is so painful for him that he just abandons it. He said, I'm going to set it aside and not do this. Luckily, he didn't destroy it. He gave it to his friend John Forster, who, 20 years later becomes Dickens' literary executor and writes the first complete biography of Dickens in 1872. But Dickens swore when he explained all of this to Forster in the late 1840s that he had never even disclosed to his own wife the story of misery and woe that he felt sort of characterized his childhood. So what was so painful about the autobiographical fragment? When Dickens was 11, his father was arrested for debt and thrown into the Marshalsea debtor's prison. Dickens' elder sister had won a scholarship to study music at the Royal Academy. So she was set. She was going to go study music at the Royal Academy anyway. It was common practice at that time that a debtor who was put into a debtor's prison had to actually pay rent on their set. They had to pay their own way. They still had to pay for their own meals. They had to pay for rent on their cell. They could have a bigger cell or a smaller cell depending on what they could pay. They could have better meals or no meals at all, but it all depended on their ability to pay. Needless to say, his father being in debt and then being thrown into the debtor's prison did not solve any financial problems for Fiddler. It intensified because now you have 2 domiciles that you have to maintain. You already have no money. What happens is Dickens's younger siblings all go to live in the Marshalsea prison with his father. And his mother and his siblings all go into the Marshalsea prison. But at the ripe old age of 11, Dickens is deemed by his parents sufficiently old enough to begin supporting himself. And so they send him off to live in a little tiny garret apartment at the top of a house that is owned by a family friend of theirs, or not a close friend, sort of a family acquaintance. And they get him a job through a cousin at a shoe blacking factory, where he labels bottles. He glues the paper labels onto the bottles. And he is absolutely traumatized by this. Here he is, as he sees it, a nice middle-class boy with all kinds of aspirations, suddenly rendered as impoverished as any kid, on the streets in London, which is not quite true. There's a bit of self-pity. There were certainly children who had it worse than Dickens in 1840s London, 1810s London, 1820s London. But he feels incredibly hurt by all of this, and he's incredibly lonely. And this is the formative experience of the early part of his life. So this only lasts for about 6 or 8 months, we think. The records are sort of scanty. There are a couple of scholars who've done a lot of work on this, sort of trying to dig up the old court filings and all of this stuff. And we think through their intervention that this probably only lasted 6 to 8 months. But 6 to 8 months when you're 11 years old feels like a lifetime. And whatever Dickens' sort of overestimate of his suffering and whatnot, I'm sure that it felt very real to him in the 1820s at that age. This is what he had to say about in one spot. This was published in John Forster's biography of Dickens in 1872, but it is the literal language of the autobiographical fragment which Forster printed in its entirety. No words can express the secret agony of my soul as I sunk into this companionship. Compared these everyday associates with those of my happier childhood, and felt my early hopes of growing up to be a learned and distinguished man crushed in my breast. The deep remembrance of the sense I had being utterly neglected and hopeless, of the shame I felt in my position, of the misery it was to my young heart to believe that day by day what I had learned and thought and delighted in, and raised my fancy and my emulation up by, was passing away from me, never to be brought back anymore, cannot be written. My whole nature was so penetrated with the grief and humiliation of such considerations that even now, famous and caressed and happy, I often forget in my dreams that I have a dear wife and children, even that I am a man, and wander desolately back to that time of my life. A little bit later, he says, I know I do not exaggerate, unconsciously and unintentionally, the scantiness of my resources and the difficulties of my life. I know that if a shilling or so were given me by anyone, I spent it in a dinner or a tea. I know that I worked from morning to night with common men and boys, shabby child. I know that I tried, but ineffectually, not to anticipate my money and to make it last the week through, by putting it away in a drawer I had in the counting house, wrapped into 6 little parcels, each parcel containing the same amount and labeled with a different day. I know that I have lounged about the streets insufficiently and unsatisfactorily fed. I know that but for the mercy of God, I might easily have been, for any care that was taken of me, a little robber or a little vagabond. He felt that he was special. Felt that he was smart, that he was sensitive, that he had been doing all the things that a middle-class boy should have been doing to get his education and to find ways to raise himself up. And he's absolutely crushed by this episode of his life. And for me, this is one of the things that distinguishes King Salver's novel from Dickens' novel. King Salver's novel, I'll say more about this in a second. King Salver's novel is brilliant in terms of its anger, incandescent anger about the plight of children in Appalachia. Poverty, impoverished children in Appalachia, and children who have been victims of the opioid crisis in Appalachia. I mean, all of this stuff, I think, is very poignant. What's missing for me in King Salver is this level of intimate detail, this level of sort of intimate and very personalized sorrow and rage. And, so she's sort of enraged on behalf of children, not so much enraged on behalf of the one child who's married think. And so I think there's something in that for you. I'll talk about that. So, you know, Dickens says things in David Copperfield that are incredibly intimate. This is a passage in which David, you all read David Copperfield? You familiar with David Copperfield? Yeah. David Copperfield is, you know, the early part of that book, David's, his father, he's a posthumous child in terms of his father. His father's dead before he's born. And he lives with his mother, and then when his mother gets remarried, David and his stepfather do not agree, I think is probably the politest way to say this. And David is shipped off to boarding school. And the first time he comes home at Christmas, he already feels like there is this chasm between him and his mother that the stepfather has sort of opened up and enforced. And when he comes home for Christmas for the first time, as he's walking in the door, he can hear his mother singing in a low voice. And he doesn't know what that's about necessarily. And he reflects on how this seems to awaken incredibly early memories for him. His mother must have sung like this to him when he was very, very little. And as he walks through the house trying to get to his mother, he comes around the corner and looks at her. He realizes that she has a new baby that she's nursing. And he did not know. And, you know, that there's something intensely personal about that experience, I have to imagine. And that's the sort of thing, we don't get to see, I think, Damon's, in Demon Copperhead, we don't get to see Damon having that kind of response to his own little sibling, right? His mother dies, the sibling dies, but there's not a moment quite like this that seems so intensely intimate. And this is at the end of that same chapter, David Copperfield, as he's going back to school, realizing that the chasm between him and his mother is something that cannot be closed and will not be closed. He's departed, and his mother comes out and saying goodbye to him, holds the baby up so that he can see the baby out the back window of the carriage as he's driving away. And then, again, it's described in these intensely personal terms. And to me, again, this is something that King Solomor's novel does not do, which does not mean that I don't like King Solomor's novel. It just means that it's a different novel. And if you think about, you know, what I was saying back at the beginning, King Solomor basically says, I thank Dickens for David Copperfield, this indictment of childhood and institutional poverty and, you know, what it does to children. Again, I think to many of us who study David Copperfield, that's not what David Copperfield is. There are a whole bunch of other Dickens novels that do that, but not this one necessarily that she is emulating. What does Demon Copperhead have to offer? A lot. I mean, it has a lot to offer. It's a really good book. It's a stark, often bleak accounting of institutional poverty in Appalachia. It gives some really interesting takes on institutional racism in that part of the country, and, you know, and what could under other circumstances I think be black and white working class solidarity, which talks about the ways in which, like, the coal mine owners and, you know, sort of the corporate types essentially try and work actively to keep the poor white citizens and the black citizens at odds with one another for their own benefit. I think that's a really interesting, you know, so there are things, if there are things that Demon Copperhead doesn't do that Copperfield does, there are also things that Demon Copperhead does that were not available to us and are not available to us in David Copperfield. There's a really intriguing incorporation of queer and trans themes, I think. And I'm not sure, I think I would have to read this novel a couple more times to sort of really formulate a sense of what I think King Solomor is up to here. But it is notable to me, if you go, and I don't necessarily recommend this, but if you go to Wikipedia and look at the plot of King Solomon's novel, like try to get the plot summary or whatever, it will give you a blow-by-blow, like which character in the novel correlates to which character in David Copperfield. And I stumbled onto this just because I was trying to recall a character's name, a minor character's name, and I didn't want to have to thumb through the entire novel again. And I had thought about this previously, but this sort of confirmed it. Damon's friend Maggot is the only character in Demon Copperhead that does not have a correlator. of the ones that are sort of enumerated by that Wikipedia page. And I thought about that, so this is why I think this is an important thing for Kingsolver. I just would have to read it a couple more times, I think, to figure out what exactly she has in mind by rewriting the novel, giving us this new character who is truly sort of her own invention, I think, in a way. And what I found to be most riveting, I think, or at least the most honest part of the book, I talked to a friend of mine and said, I really liked the first half of another Dickensian. I really liked the first half of Demon Copperhead, but I didn't like the second half. And I said, oh, I really liked the second half, and I didn't love the first half. And I think for me, it's because the second half really gets into the sort of OxyContin addiction problem in Appalachia. And I felt like somehow, and I can't put my finger on it, Kingsolver was more sincere in that part of the book. There is a sincerity, and maybe some of the intimacy that I was missing in the earlier parts when Damon is a child, and I don't think we get those really touching scenes like the ones I showed you from David Copperfield. So I'm not sure what that's about, but I did find the second half of the novel far more engaging than the first half. What does Demon Copperhead not give us, in my opinion? I think the touching and nostalgic and melancholy remembrance of the orphan boy's relationship with his mother. I think it doesn't quite go as far as Copperfield does in that regard. It also doesn't give us the very warm relationships that David Copperfield has with several surrogate mothers in Dickens' own. David doesn't have, he has a reasonably good relationship with his actual mother, and then once she dies, he has several other really warm and affectionate relationships with surrogate mothers after that. And I think that does not quite happen. In Demon Copperhead, his grandmother, who is the corollary for David Copperfield's Aunt Betsy, his grandmother doesn't really play a role. He doesn't seem to have an affectionate relationship, a loving relationship, or a deep or meaningful relationship with his grandmother. So I think that there are, there's that interlude in the book, and they keep popping up throughout the book, the macabre family that Damon is fostered upon for a while, and all that. There seems to be no affection there whatsoever. He just seems to be put upon and abused and exploited by the macabre family. There is a corollary for this family in David Copperfield. It's the macabre family in David Copperfield. And every evidence that we know of points to the fact that Mr. Macabre was modeled on Dickens' own father, with whom he had a fraught relationship. And so there's a lot more warmth in that relationship, I think, in David Copperfield than in Demon Copperhead. I also didn't think, for those of you who've read both Copperfield and Copperhead, I don't think that Ryan Piles lives up to the Uriah Heep level creepiness that we find in Dickens, the sort of fishy, clammy. I mean, Uriah Heep is so disgusting, like all through David Copperfield. He's always described as having clammy hands and fishy, and his hands and arms are described as being eel-like, and all this sort of, it's really sort of gross, the description of him. I don't know that we get quite as much of that with Ryan Piles in Copperhead. And I think that more broadly, as I said before, I think that Kingsolver's novel is harder and meaner than David Copperfield. I don't mean that makes it, again, that's not, I don't mean that pejoratively. I mean that it lacks some of that warmth and subtlety and emotional content, whatever, of David Copperfield. But again, I think that's because she really is writing a different kind of book. She has it in mind that she's writing in the wake of David Copperfield, but from my perspective, what she's mostly adopting is plot and certain character corollaries, not necessarily trying to write the same kind of book. It's not a Bildungsroman in the same way. It's not. It is. He grows up to be a graphic illustrator. So it's not as though he's not growing into a profession. But some of the subtleties and nostalgias and whatnot of youth are simply not present, I think, in Demon Copperhead as they are in David Copperfield. As I was working on figuring out what I was going to present to you today, I was looking to see what other scholars that I know, if they had anything to say about this, and I stumbled upon this by Rowan Mates, at Dalhousie University in Canada, and I thought she said it better than I could. Because I hadn't yet put my finger on quite what bothered me about the gap, between these two books, or what I made of the gap, I should say. She says it isn't that David Copperfield is not about child poverty and harsh social conditions. It's that, I would say anyway, these circumstances are incidental in David Copperfield to David's perception of his experience. In other words, David Copperfield is much more about David and his feelings and his growth and how he responds to these events in his life. And I'm not sure that we get that same sort of internal take with Dean Copperhead. And so, I'll give those last words essentially to Rowan and open it up for questions, or, and I appreciate you indulging me and letting me talk more about Dickens than about Kingston. That's really sort of my baby.
Super interesting, thank you. Do we have any first comments or questions for Sean? I have a question. When you were talking about how popular Dickens was and how well his books were selling, what was like his competition of the day? Like, who were the other writers then who were like vying for the budget of the
So there were two different, I think, kinds of competitors. There were novelists like William Thackeray was another one, Vanity Fair, Feverel, some of his other books. Thackeray was one of the few who tried to publish in the same format, where it was not serialized in a magazine, it was its own series, where there was nothing but that content. And Thackeray made it work for a couple of novels, but even he couldn't sort of pull it off. He and Dickens had a mostly friendly, but occasionally not very friendly rivalry through the 1840s and 1850s. The other thing that Dickens was competing with were the lowbrow newspapers and periodicals. So you had periodicals publishing like Penny Bloods, Penny Dreadfuls, that sort of content. And some of those were selling 500,000 copies a week, and it was one of those sort of lowbrow newspapers. It was the first British periodical we know of to cross the 1 million copies a week, Rubicon. And partly what Dickens was trying to do by publishing like this, and then increasingly he became an editor of his own magazines, and he would publish sometimes his own fiction, sometimes the fiction of collaborators and friends of his. He was quite explicit about, I want to give people something a little bit more wholesome to read than the Penny Bloods. Penny Bloods were full of, thunder and blood, right? I mean, people getting chopped up with axes, and if, excuse me, if you know the Sweeney Todd story, cannibalism, man, cannibalism sells, right? Whatever else may be true of cannibalism, it's always popular. So, there was a lot of that kind of fare for sale. And Dickens was like, I want the reading public to actually have something that qualifies as literature with a capital L, the kind of stuff we might still teach in an English classroom to this day. So those were the two. He had Thackeray and maybe a couple of others who were direct competitors trying to do exactly what he was doing by serializing his novels as standalones, novel in parts, as we call it. And then he had this other sort of vast market of like people writing some fairly lowbrow stuff that he was trying to compete against.
Thank you. Else, yeah.
So King Solver, I've read hers, I haven't read David Copperfield, but she seems to be writing, her audience is American society, American politics. And so I wonder how that differs from the society that Dickens was writing for, when he was delivering his message there that was fitting for that society, or a message he wanted to deliver to that society. And I don't know how that fits with some of the differences between them, not necessarily between Copperfield and Copperhead, but just in general in terms of their writing.
I mean, I think that's what's really interesting to me about King Solver. She could have picked almost any other Dickens novel from like the 20-year middle of his career and said, I appreciate the critique of institutional poverty and what it does to children, because like literally his books do that over and over and over again, because it was an important message for his society, right? I've often talked with students about the fact that Dickens often makes poverty and things like that fun, to the extent that he can make them fun. Why does he make them fun? Because the people who were impoverished couldn't read, by and large. So he's not writing he's writing about them, but not to them. He's writing to middle-class readers who can actually do something about the poverty, right? Who can actually do something about So Kingsolver's book, I think, is not very funny, very, very often. But she's also got, as you point out, a very different reading public. And I think that she really is excellent at conveying that sense of sort of rage and diminished opportunity and, you know, all of these things that we sort of need to be cognizant of in the 2020s when it comes to figuring out our own issues of social and economic justice. Especially, you know, we tend to think of poverty as being an urban problem. It's not an urban problem, not exclusively an urban problem. It is very much a rural problem as well. And so I think she understands that, and she's able to sort of get that message out. But she also has a much more literate society than Dickens was dealing with in 1849 or 1850. So the goals are, I think, somewhat different. And it might be that, you know, by and large, I mean, you know, I said in one of my slides, Dickens' novel Bleak House is probably the most ferocious attack on institutional poverty of all of the books that he ever wrote. That one also has an autobiographical narrator. He gives us half of the book is told from the perspective of an omniscient narrator, and the other half is a young woman who's an orphan. And I think part of the reason that he does that is, again, because he knows he's got middle-class readers. He wants to play on their sympathies. He's, you know, the fact that poverty existed was not universally acknowledged as a bad thing in society in the 19th century. Maybe it's not now. It should be. But in the 19th century, there was, you know, this was the era of laissez-faire economics. He's writing David Copperfield 5 years after the beginning of the Irish potato famine, where enough food was being produced in it to feed the entire Irish population. But it was being produced in Ireland on land that British landowners owned, and so they were forcing its export so that they could retain their profits. And there was talk about, I mean, one of the famous lines from A Christmas Carol is Scrooge saying to the people who are coming around collecting for Christmas, they're collecting charity for Christmas. And Scrooge says, you know, what sounds like this is the surplus population. It really was an idea that poor people were simply the surplus population. You let them die off. I mean, this is Thomas Malthus, this is Jeremy Bentham, and John Mill, and, you know, the other sort of political economy figures of the early part of the 19th century. So Dickens, I think, maybe needed to make this emotional more so than Kingsolver does, and that might account for the difference. That's a great question. Oh no, now I'm getting a hard question. I work with this person, so she can put me on the spot.
Sean's my boss.
Boss.
Well, insofar as we have this. You're my temporary overlord.
Temporary.
So first, my great-grandma Sally thanks you for the nod to the conditions of the Irish potato famine, right? Not manufacturing crisis.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So I wonder, I think that was such an interesting question too, and I wonder if Kingsolver maybe sort of intuited something really important. She could have chosen any of these other books,
yeah,
but she sort of like sees in David Copperfield the kind of narrator she needs to write the book that the U.S. American public really, it'll resonate with, right?
Yeah.
She needs this person who's been there, but also has the skill set to tell the story. So
yeah.
do you think she maybe is doing some sort of Frankenstein work there, where she's like pulling from, you know, Bleak House and Oliver Twist, but also seeing like, oh, you know, I can get almost the literal Charles Dickens to tell my story for me?
Yeah, I mean, that's entirely possible. And it's clear that Kingsolver, I mean, if you read the entirety of like her acknowledgments or afterward or whatever it is, she is emotionally invested. It's like she is from and grew up in and has relatives in and has a stake in what's going on in Appalachia. Okay? So yeah, it may just be that she wanted to tell this in the first person. And that made, you know, Dickens didn't write in the first person very often. He wrote David Copperfield, and then 10 years later he wrote Great Expectations. And then there's Bleak House, which is sort of, you know, split half and half. And, you know, if you ask most Dickens scholars, they will say David Copperfield is the more factual autobiographical novel, Great Expectations is the more intimate. It's the more sort of thoughtful about feelings of shame and guilt and all these other kinds of things. She might have felt like she needed that first person narrator to really sort of articulate, here's what happens to a child under these conditions, right? Here's what, so in that sense, it is David Copperfield-esque. But yeah, she might have been, I mean, it's clear from the way that she poses that afterward. She's Team Dickens all the way, right? I mean, she loves the fact that he was outraged about childhood poverty. He was outraged about these other circumstances, because she's outraged too. So it might have been, yes, that David Copperfield provides the vehicle by which I can tell the kind of story that I want to tell. But all this other rage that sort of, filters in from Dickens' other books and that she has imbibed from Dickens' book need to be part of it also. For me, the book would have worked better if it had more of the emotional sort of subtlety and pull that I'm missing. But you all, I mean, if any of you who have read this, I cannot read this novel without David Copperfield in my brain, right? Knowing that it was pulled from and modeled after David Copperfield, like the whole time that I read it, even though I was trying not to do this, like, ooh, and this character must be so and so. Ooh, and this character, and she only very thinly disguises the character names. I mean, she almost redoes them, from David Copperfield. So it's not like it's a real hard detective job to figure out who is who. So maybe if I had not read David Copperfield and didn't have so much sort of foreknowledge of David Copperfield, I would not have found this to be as much of a gap, right? I mean, I'm a Dickens scholar for a reason, right? I mean, there's something that I find incredibly compelling about his books. But her book is compelling too.
All right, so the last quick question. If you could recommend one Dickens book only for us to read, which one would you pick?
Man, I'm probably Bleak House. Probably Bleak House. Danielle is nodding her head vigorously. Having said that, I hated when I was in grade school they tried to make me read Great Expectations. I hated it. And then I read it again in college, and I was like, oh, this isn't as bad as I remember. And I read it in graduate school. I was like, hey, Dickens might have been onto something. And what I have figured out is that when you are 12 or whatever, you don't get all of Great Expectations like angst about really messing up your life in profound ways, and it's all sort of gone to heck in a handbasket or whatever. Like you don't have, if you have a life filled with ancient regret by the time you're 12, you have really had a life, right, at that point. So Great Expectations has crept up there for me, specifically because it has made more and more sense the older I get. The older I get and look back on my blasted life, so Great Expectations is a close second, but I think I'd have to say Bleak House.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We
Thank you
appreciate
all.
you being here. All of our copies of King Solomon's Book